Well, this is not really a surprise. What we're talking about for today is the latest round of balance tuning announced for patch 11.1. Now, while this is not necessarily a surprise, the last round of tuning before the release of the patch, what is going to be a bit more surprising will be some of the magnitude, the size, the chunkiness of some of these changes, which are somewhat weird, in some cases difficult to decipher, but we can start slow. You know, we can start with some more mellow and laid-back changes, like, for example, the first one in the line of changes is the flat 5% damage buff given to both Frost Death Knight and Unholy Death Knight. So, both of them are gaining a 5% damage buff. Now, according to pre-changes, so these are not sims after all of these buffs and nerfs, but before any of this was touched and any of this was changed, Frost was doing actually kind of okay. That's why it's a bit more surprising that Frost is buffed at the same magnitude as Unholy is. Unholy was lagging behind a bit more than Frost was, so with this 5% buff, Unholy should be above the 2.7 million DPS line, whereas Frost should get into the 2.8 million DPS in single target sims. So it's interesting that both specs have been buffed at an equal size, despite the fact that Frost DK was doing slightly better. And also, generally speaking, Frost has been the more popular between these two specs, even for Season 1. Another change, which isn't really doing anything, is the change to Demon Hunter, because Aldrachi River of Havoc Demon Hunter is getting its bug fixes to prevent them from doing free extra damage by having Wounded Quarry, this much talked about effect, double dip with the Thrill of the Fight buff, as well as River's Glaive, double dip with Thrill of the Fight. This is not too bad for Havoc. Don't think that this is doom and gloom, because the sims that put you at near to or at 2.8 million DPS and amongst the higher simming specs as Aldrachi after your Wounded Quarry bug was cooked into your 3 normally without being removed, these sims were done already with these bugs fixed in mind. So all of this doesn't actually do anything for the simulations of Havoc. These were already being considered when Havoc was being simmed. So that's a good thing for Havoc, which remains a quite high performing spec, at least on paper right now. Who isn't, because you would need to have a paper to begin with, is Feral, who is being buffed. You have the melee auto attack damage increased by 25%, adaptive swarm dot is increased by 25%, your 2-piece set bonus, the big winner damage, is increased by 40%, and lastly even more buffs to Wild Stalker. Now, first of all, this is just a typo. It's actually the 4-piece set bonus, big winner, that gets buffed, so the finisher basically. After you consume APC, Apex Predator's Craving, your big winner dealing 800% attack power damage. That's buffed by 40%. More importantly, what gets buffed is practically Wild Stalker. So now this, which has not been the to-go build for Feral over Druid of the Claw, after these buffs, both just the damage buff of your Wild Stalker 3 as well as the damage buff of Adaptive Swarm, which is taken when you play Wild Stalker rather than when you play Druid of the Claw, simply because Wild Stalker puts dots on your enemies, Adaptive Swarm makes your dot 25% stronger, so it just goes hand in hand with the hero talent. With these changes, it looks like Wild Stalker is now ahead of Druid of the Claw for Feral to be played, at least in single target, after these buffs to Feral. We still don't know the full picture of how well they are performing compared to other sims, because Feral is lagging a bit behind in terms of releasing their sims. So the bigger change of note in this case would be to switching to a different hero talent with 11.1. Now, Devastation Evoker gets a flat 6% damage increase, which is a somewhat of a compensation because of their 2-piece set bonus no longer grants Essence Burst from Shattering Star procs. So the relevancy of this change is that when you were playing Devastation, you no longer get these Essence Burst from the Shattering Star procs for free. The ones that proc from your 2-piece set bonus for free. Your damaging spells have a chance to hit a jackpot launching a Shattering Star at 3 nearby enemies. This this part was also giving you procs, now it doesn't anymore, so in return you have been buffed by 6%. It is still somewhat neutral, it's not an actual nerf, this one. Also Devastation was simming averagely good, it was in the 2.6 and up type of simming for now, so it wasn't doing that badly. We have a flat buff and a flat nerf going the way of Hunter. You have Marksmanship getting all of their damage dealt increased by 6%, and BM having all of their damage dealt reduced by 8%. Now this makes a bit sense for Marksmanship, because based on the sims, Marksmanship was actually lagging behind. It was the weakest of the simming specs for Hunter, and amongst the weaker ones of the specs that had been done with their sims, and BM was performing extremely well. Not as much in single target, where they already were one of the best, like 4 or 5 simming specs, but even more so in AoE. We have mentioned what the problem was with Beast Mastery Hunter and their potent mutagen tier set. The problem was that when you were proccing your jackpot or casting Bestial Rat, you would buff your pet for 8 seconds with this potent mutagen, which would splash AoE damage up to 5 enemies, and the damage was very high. But the damage, of course, is getting higher in AoE, because of course the more enemies you have, the more you can splash this potent mutagen around. If you're fighting in single target, there is only one target to benefit from this potent mutagen, but if you had 5 targets, an AoE pack in Mythic Plus, for example, that's where you had most of its value. The result is that now Hunter Beast Mastery gets nerfed by 8%. It's obviously still gonna hurt in single target, but it's gonna have a bigger effect in AoE, basically in Mythic Plus, and then Marksmanship gets buffed by 6% to now be closer up with BM and even Survival when it comes to their single target damage. We take a very short break for 1 second out of the DPS to mention healers, because Holy Paladin has all of his healing done increased by 4%, and Restoration Shaman gets all of his healing increased by 4%. So it's good that we, collected the results of the PTR performance, because that's what you could tell when we looked at the healers, that the 2 worst performing ones by a reasonable margin were Resto Shaman and Holy Paladin. So now we have the confirmation that this was at least useful for something, and to point out that these 2 specs were quite lower down the others, and now they're buffed by 4%. Now, arguably, this is still useless in the sense that they still have many more problems than this. Holy Paladin, problems with their talent tree, their Avenging Crusader build, and still their mana issues. For Resto Shaman, it might not be about their talent tree, but way more so about their mana. Restoration Shaman is still extremely mana hungry, and nothing is being done with the release of this patch to fix this. It's practically impossible to imagine a Resto Shaman to live a 5+ minute long fight being able to heal at the same level as others due to their mana costs at the moment. So yeah, sure, it's a tiny healing done buff, which still is not really fixing the major problems of the specs. Back to DPS and back to compensation. First, you have Shadow Priest. Shadow Priest, as we actually just went through our list, yes, Shadow Priest was also one of the better performing ones in PTR testing, at least. Shadow Priest is getting a massive buff. Seems like a massive buff, right? It's like all damage increased by 13%. You're like, wait, what am I missing if it was doing so well in the testing? And that's because their tier set is being nerfed. The 2-piece set bonus free proc of Void Bolt triggers less often. The Void Bolt itself now does 100% damage instead of 200% damage. And the 4-piece set bonus now gives you Mind Blast and Void Bolt damage by 10% when you have PI on you instead of 15%. Now this is relevant because on our temporary sims before all of these changes, the value of the Shadow Priest's tier set combined in total was extremely high. 27% of your damage was coming as a buff from your tier set. BM also, before the fix of their potent mutagen, which has been fixed already, was at 33%, and the other highest spec in terms of tier set increase was Subtlety, which is getting the same treatment as Shadow Priest is. So Shadow Priest is getting this tier set nerfed in damage by a lot, and in return they are getting a 13% damage increase compensation. This should still net up to be a nerf, but now you have a more inline power level of your tier set. This is completely irrelevant because Void Weaver is still not a viable, playable hero talent for Shadow anyways. For Subtlety, you have the same treatment we just mentioned because of how more powerful their tier set was. What they did is they are buffing the base damage of Subtlety by 10%, and in return they are nerfing the damage stacking of your 2-piece as well as the further shadow damage stacking of your 4-piece. This actually is cooked a little bit worse than Shadow because this is actually a larger nerf. It nets out to be a 3-something% nerf for Subtlety, and also a larger nerf condensed into your burst window, because that's what the tier set was and that's what you were getting your damage increase into. It's like a 15% weaker burst that Subtlety has when playing Trickster. Even also with some compensations in here, buffing Trickster still keeps Trickster ahead of Deathstalker, at least in single target, but the overall result of this is that now you are doing slightly less damage even in single target. Outlaw is getting practically nothing, and Assassination is getting not even a 1% single target damage buff and barely a 3% AoE damage buff with these changes, which are irrelevant because nobody was playing Assassination in AoE or in Mythic Plus to begin with. Affliction does get some set flat rounds of buffs across the board. You have your Dark Lair being buffed by doing more damage based on the dots on your target. Focused Malignancy buffed again. Now it has an even bigger buff to Malefic Rapture when they are affected by Unstable Affliction, and then flat out buffs to UA, Shadowbolt and Drain Soul. This still seems to be a problem, even though Affliction still didn't have fully complete working sims. The voices in the corridors and the preliminary sims actually struggled to make the specs go above 2 million. They were practically competing with Protection Warrior to be above 2.1, 2.2 million DPS compared to the other specs, which to be considered okay, you were in the 2.5, 2.4, 2.6 range. Affliction especially wasn't even there to begin with, together with Demonology as well. And these changes are still not enough. It is common. The common thought is that Warlocks would just need a flat aura buff, or just Affliction Warlocks damage increase by 15%, just as a starter. Now, in reverse, you have Arms and Fury Warriors damage both nerfed by 5%. This is after a long series of continued buffs 2 weeks in a row given to Arms and Fury, to the point that it made them the best simming specs in the upcoming patch. Yep, some other specs were doing better temporarily because of some bugs, like Havoc with Wounded Quarry, BM with their bugged tier set, even Windwalker for a bit, but no. After the buffs, Arms and Fury were by far the strongest. So now they're getting a flat 5% damage nerf, which should bring them back to around 2.9, which is the same level you might be seeing some of these specs temporarily or partially, like Havoc, like Windwalker, possibly Enhancement Shaman. At that level is where you want to put Warriors back. This still doesn't mean Warriors are poor or weak. They are still amongst the better ones, just not nearly as strong. Now, we have left the big one for last, of course, which is the nerfs to Augmentation Evoker. So, Shifting Sands, practically your versatility buff that gives away verse to players, has been nerfed by 20%, so you have less amount of versatility, which is good, not just for the damage, but also for the damage reduction you can get. Breath of Eons now accumulates 8% of damage taken instead of 10%. Close as Clutchmates. This would be the final nail in the coffin. Close as Clutchmates, which just recently was announced to be coming back in 11.1, increases the effectiveness of Ebonmite and Breath of Eons by 10% outside of raid instead of 25%. So this was coming when Blizzard announced that these buffs, practically your Ebonmite, all of your other buffs, weren't going to affect tanks and healers. They said, okay, if Mythic Plus has 5 players, but we're not gonna make these buffs count for 2 of them, so you only have 3 left, then we are at least buffing this effect. Now the effect is buffed by an even smaller amount. On top of the burst value of Breath of Eons nerfed even more, on top of the passive damage of Shifting Sands and passive damage reduction of Shifting Sands reduced by an extra 20%. This is currently just from the numbers making Augmentation the worst spec in the game, the worst DPS spec in the game. It should be, from all logic and all reason, Augmentation is a dead spec in 11.1. It's not usable in Mythic Plus. The damage buff now you give to your DPS only in Mythic Plus no longer warrants them being brought, because it's just not enough to match a DPS, normal DPS, and on top of that, you're still not giving what used to be, what is currently even is right now in live, a good part of your toolkit, which is giving primary stat to the healer to heal more, primary stat to the tank to be tankier, so that is gone already. And on top of that being gone, now you also do not even enough damage to actually be a damage boost to your party. So Augmentation should be dead. This time, I know this has been repeated about 14 times since the implementation of Augmentation in Dragonflight, and every single time this was mentioned, it turned out not to be true, because as we know very well, Augmentation has been meta ever since it has been released in this game. However, we can say this is the closest time to being sure that Augmentation is dead. It's definitely closest to be true in Mythic Plus. It just isn't worth bringing this spec anymore, because it just doesn't give you enough damage. Practically at this point, you might as well bring a priest with power infusion and do the damage buff increase of Augmentation if, for example, Shadow Priest in Mythic Plus is very powerful and doing very well, which it is right now in AoE, so you might as well do that over running on Augmentation. Now, in the raid, maybe, in the raid you might as well just say bring an Aug or bring a BM Hunter or bring another Warlock. It's not nearly the same level of let's just bring 2 or 3 Augs to get our buffs in order, etc, etc. It's still also not nearly as powerful in a raid setting as well. But the raiding is not nearly as relevant. You have 14 spots for your DPS. It's much easier for you to find room in a raid environment. This was much more important for Mythic Plus. The assassination of Augmentation was much more important for Mythic Plus, because Mythic Plus only has 3 spots for the DPS, so obviously keeping one spot permanently reserved to Augmentation was making the entire meta much worse. It was limiting the amount of compositions you could go for. It was also limiting other specs in your class, namely Preservation and Devastation, from ever finding any room when Augmentation existed. So this is very, very good. Auspicious change for Aug. Blizzard throwing the towel and admitting they cannot balance a support spec in this game, especially as long as there is only one support spec and you don't have the option of 4 to 5. So with just one of them, it's impossible to balance, and this should be the final nail in the coffin for 11.1 to kill this spec. Yes, this time, no copium, no hopium. We are confident they cannot make it out alive after these changes. This time for sure. It cannot happen again. It's the 17th time in a row now. This will put them out of the meta in Mythic Plus. And this was, of course, the biggest, bestest change when it comes to DPS for this season. However, there is one more talking about meta, which is the one for Discipline, which was another expected, very high level, predicted class spec to come for 11.1. So this actually is just the fixing of a bug which has existed since the beta and was not changed. Now this is coming at a very funny moment. It's coming at a very funny moment because throughout this PTR, Blizzard just showed us that they basically just go for the this is not a bug, this is just a feature treatment. So they give, Havoc, they give their bug and cook it into their toolkit with Wounded Quarry and they don't remove it. For BM, they do the same. They just keep those bugs. Maybe they rebalance the spec as a result, but the bugs stay there. Not for Discipline, because the bug in question for Discipline was the fact that when Void Weaver was introduced in the game and they gave you the option to turn your Shadow Fiend into a Void Wrath. Now this effectively didn't really do anything special. It did some more damage than your normal Shadow Fiend, but for anything else it wasn't really needed. It wasn't really necessary. It's just that the other talent, Depth of Shadow, was terrible, so you were just defaulting to Void Rat. However, players quickly realized that if you talented into Mindbender, which most Discipline Priest players were doing, and all of them were doing in Mythic Plus, what happened is that your Void Rat would still retain all of the stats, all of the numbers, all of the default effects of Shadow Fiend, not of your weaker version, Mindbender. So the mana regen of Void Rat, if you took the Mindbender talent, should have been 0.2% mana each time the Mindbender attacks. Instead, it was 0.5% because it was copying Shadow Fiend. If you took Mindbender with Void Rat was still doing 25% more damage like the Shadow Fiend does. And much more importantly, Shadow Covenant. Shadow Covenant is what gives you your 20 to 35% more healing from your Shadow spells, depending on whether or not you have the big version, Shadow Fiend, or the small version, Mindbender. If you took Mindbender but had Void Rat talented, Void Rat would still behave as a Shadow Fiend. So it would still behave giving you 35% more healing from your Shadow spells instead of 20%. The TLDR is that with these changes, all of this goes away. Void Rat now does 25% less damage if you have Mindbender. Void Rat now has reduced effectiveness of Shadow Covenant if you're talented into Mindbender, and Void Rat now returns 0.2% of your mana instead of 0.5% if you're talented into Mindbender. These are, of course, catastrophic nerfs to the power of Discipline. It's practically a 15% healing nerf at all times whenever you have Shadow Covenant and Mindbender active. It also takes away your infinite mana, because having Mindbender on practically a 30-second cooldown, giving you back 0.5% of your mana per attack because it was behaving like a Shadow Fiend instead, was basically making you immune from going out of mana. So all of this now goes away. Now if you go, for example, right now on the PTR and try to do the same key you were doing yesterday, you will be doing 15% less healing if you are playing with Mindbender, for example. Now, this, to be fair, still opens up some exciting scenarios if this was true, and also, to be fair, is not nearly as punishing in the raid. Because in the raid, it was more likely for a Discipline Priest to not go Mindbender and instead play around 90-second timers with your Shadow Fiend plus your Evangelism in 11.1, so it wasn't nearly as bad. Also, it starts opening up more and more possibilities of you playing Oracle. Because now, with this Mindbender nerfed to such an extent, you can simply forget Mindbender and play Twilight Equilibrium to give you back your 15% damage you have lost. Because in Void Weaver you cannot play with this, because as Void Weaver your Smite changes into a Shadow spell. So you don't have the Holy spell to make Twilight Equilibrium work. But if you play Oracle, your Smite is Holy damage, which works with Twilight Equilibrium. So you would be fixing the 15% less damage you are losing from playing a Mindbender to instead play Twilight Equilibrium. Plus, Oracle itself is still quite powerful. There might be ways between Twinsight, the 3 extra stacks of your penance to give more value to your Wheel and Woe, as well as the flat 40% damage increase of your spells, as well as, of course, your Piety extra cooldown you can play with. It might open up and give you a chance to play Oracle as well, particularly in the raid. But definitely, at face value, the currently existing build of Discipline Priest has been nerfed significantly in terms of healing. Not nearly as much in terms of damage, but definitely in terms of the healing done, it's a big hit. So these were the last 2 biggest changes we left for last: Void Weaver, Discipline Priest, as well as Augmentation Evoker as a whole. The other ones were relevant, tidbits of changes, some buffs, some nerfs. They all made pretty much more or less sense, so nothing too surprising there. But these are the ones we are getting, likely, of course, before the release of the patch. We don't know yet if these will be all before the release of the actual season, but it's likely. It's unlikely we will hit the weekly reset of the beginning of the season with a bunch of balance tuning thrown on top. Unless it is to fix some bugs or some broken interactions, it's unlikely we will see any. So we have a possible last round of tuning before the season comes out. This one will be. This is what we have for today, on this Saturday, on this weekend, so we can simmer over these changes and theory craft and think about what these all will do for the release of the season. But for today, we can now leave each other. We're starting the goodbyes as usual by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone who's been supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, do you hear the bird concert in the background?